NPC stands for non-player character, but online it has quietly evolved into something far more unsettling than a gaming term. Because once human interaction starts following predictable dialogue paths, it becomes difficult to tell where thinking ends and scripting begins. And the strange part is how normal it looks from the inside. By 2026, NPC conversations is no longer just internet slang. It is a description of a communication pattern where people respond not by generating thought, but by retrieving socially optimized templates that reduce effort, risk, and emotional unpredictability. What most explanations get wrong is assuming this is about stupidity. It is not. It is about cognitive efficiency under social pressure, where the brain prioritizes safety, speed, and acceptance over originality or truth. And this is where psychology starts to break down. Because every conversation begins with uncertainty. And uncertainty is expensive. It requires real-time model building, emotional calibration, and risk assessment. So the brain quietly defaults to pre-tested responses that have previously worked in similar situations. But what makes this even more unusual is how quickly those responses standardize across millions of people. Greetings become identical, sympathy becomes formulaic. Agreement becomes compressed into a few recycled phrases that signal alignment without adding information. And this detail changes everything. Because once language becomes predictable, thought begins to follow it. People don't just say similar things, they begin thinking in similar pathways. Because language is the interface that shapes which ideas are even accessible in the first place. Which leads to a far darker mechanism. Many conversations are not exchanges of information. They are confirmation loops. One person speaks to trigger a socially acceptable response, not to update reality, but to validate that reality is still socially stable. And researchers notice something unexpected. Most interactions end without any actual belief change on either side. Both participants leave feeling understood, even though no internal model has meaningfully updated. This is where cognitive dissonance quietly disappears instead of resolving. Because if nothing new enters the system, nothing needs to be reconciled. The conversation feels successful purely because it did not break expectations, not because it produced insight. But what makes this even more unusual is how NPC-like behavior emerges under uncertainty. When people are unsure what to say, they don't explore, meaning they default to socially reinforced scripts, humor templates, reaction phrases, emotional placeholders. And this detail changes everything. Because authenticity stops being about originality. It becomes about recognizability. If a response matches expected patterns, it is treated as valid, even if it contains no real cognitive contribution. Which leads to escalation inside group dynamics. In larger groups, conversational individuality collapses even further. People unconsciously align their tone, opinions, and emotional intensity to match perceived group consensus. This is conformity bias operating in real time, where deviation feels riskier than silence. And silence itself becomes meaningful. Not speaking is interpreted as disinterest, disagreement, or disengagement, which pressures participants back into safe, minimal-effort responses just to maintain social visibility. But what makes this even more unusual is how digital platforms amplify the NPC effect. Autocomplete, reaction buttons, reply suggestions, and algorithmically boosted phrasing reduce the need for original language construction. And this detail changes everything again. Because now, conversation is partially pre-written by predictive systems trained on billions of prior interactions. The system doesn't just reflect language, it compresses it into statistically safe outputs that users gradually adopt as their own thinking style. Which leads to a subtle identity shift. People begin to understand themselves less through what they think, and more through what they can successfully say without friction. Identity becomes shaped by conversational survivability rather than depth of reasoning. And researchers notice something even more counterintuitive. The most natural speakers are often the most scripted. Fluency comes from repetition, not invention. So what feels authentic is frequently just highly optimized social automation. This is where psychology folds inward. Because once scripted responses are rewarded with social approval and unpredictable responses are ignored or penalized, NPC behavior stops being an exception. It becomes the default equilibrium of low-risk communication environments. But what makes this even more unusual is how memory distorts the experience. People recall conversations as more meaningful than they actually were, because the brain reconstructs coherence after the fact, filling in gaps with assumed depth that never existed in real-time exchange. And this detail changes everything again, because it means communication is shallow during interaction, but artificially deep in memory, which reinforces the illusion that understanding occurred even when no real cognitive update took place, which leads to a final escalation layer. Over time, entire social ecosystems stabilize around predictable interaction loops. People learn what responses keep conversations smooth, what phrases signal safety, and what emotional expressions avoid friction. The system becomes less about expression and more about maintenance of social equilibrium. And once that equilibrium forms, novelty starts to feel disruptive instead of valuable, because it forces the system to reprocess meaning instead of recycling it. So the real NPC effect is not that people stop thinking. It is that thinking becomes optional in most interactions, and anything optional eventually gets replaced by what is faster, safer, and already socially approved. And somewhere in that space between automatic replies and unspoken thoughts, every conversation starts to feel like a dialogue tree, someone else already optimized for you. So yeah, like and subscribe before this turns into a preset response too.